I descended in darkness. The Atlas shuddered around me as the winch cable lowered the crawler deeper into the Charlie Gibbs fracture zone. 40 tons of industrial mech built to walk the ocean floor, and right now it hung suspended like a toy on a string. I sat strapped into the pilot's seat, trying to keep my breathing steady while the pressure hull creaked and groaned with every meter we dropped. Through the reinforced viewport, I watched the sunlight die. It happened in stages. First, the brilliant blues faded to murky greens. Then the greens turned gray. Then everything went black, and I was alone in a metal coffin sinking into the Atlantic. My chest tightened. The familiar panic crept in at the edges, that feeling like the walls were closing in, even though I knew they weren't. Claustrophobia had been my problem since I was a kid, and you'd think after 6 years working deep-sea repair, I would have gotten over it. I hadn't. Every descent felt like the first one, like being buried alive in slow motion. I forced myself to focus on the instruments. The depth gauge read 700 meters and climbing. Water temperature had dropped to 4 degrees Celsius. The winch system showed green across the board. Everything normal. Everything fine. Except it didn't feel fine. The company had sent me down here 3 days after Trunk 7 went dark. Trunk 7 was one of the big ones, a transatlantic fiber optic cable carrying about 15% of all internet traffic between North America and Europe. When something like that fails, people notice. Stock markets get nervous. The company gets frantic. And guys like me get dropped into the deep ocean to fix it. I'd done cable repairs before. Splice work mostly. Sometimes a fishing trawler snagged a line or a submarine landslide buried a section. Standard stuff. But Trunk 7 had gone dark without warning. No seismic activity, no ship traffic in the area. Just offline, like someone flipped a switch. The briefing had been rushed. Get down there, locate the failure point, assess the damage, make temporary repairs if possible. If not, mark it for the heavy equipment and come back up. Simple job. Routine. So why did my hands feel clammy inside the control gloves? The Atlas jerked slightly as the descent speed adjusted. I checked the cable tension readouts, saw them fluctuate and stabilize. Outside the viewport, there was nothing. Pure black. The kind of darkness that felt solid, like it had weight and texture. I could see my own reflection in the glass. Pale face, stubble I hadn't bothered shaving, eyes that looked too wide. I looked away. The sonar system pinged softly, updating its readings every few seconds. I pulled up the display on the left monitor, grateful for something to do with my attention. The screen showed the trench floor rising to meet me, still about 200 meters down. Topography looked rough, lots of rocky outcrops and uneven terrain, normal for a fracture zone. But then I saw the debris. I leaned forward, studying the sonar image. Scattered across the seafloor were dozens of irregular shapes, clustered in patterns that didn't make sense. Too dense to be natural rock formations, too random to be geological features. I cycled through the sonar frequencies, trying to get a clearer picture. The shapes remained unclear, just vague contacts showing up as bright spots on the display. Some were small, maybe a meter across. Others were larger, 3 or 4 meters. They were concentrated near the coordinates where Trunk 7 had failed. That wasn't right. The briefing hadn't mentioned debris. The route surveys from 6 months ago showed clear seafloor, nothing but sediment and basalt. Whatever I was looking at had appeared recently. I pulled up the mission data on the right monitor, double-checking the coordinates. No mistake. Trunk 7's failure point was right in the middle of that debris field. A new thought occurred to me, one I didn't like. What if something hit the cable? A rockfall, maybe, or some kind of underwater avalanche. That would explain the debris and the sudden failure. But the fracture zone was geologically stable. The survey said so. The risk assessment said so. The Atlas jerked again, harder this time. I grabbed the armrests, felt the whole crawler sway on the cable. The depth gauge showed 900 meters. Getting close now. I tried to swallow, but my throat felt tight. The cockpit suddenly seemed smaller than it had 5 minutes ago. I could hear every sound. The hum of the life support system, the click of the control relays, my own breathing inside the confined space. Focus. Do your job. I ran through the post-descent checklist, flipping switches and checking systems. Hydraulics green, power plant stable, ballast tank sealed. The Atlas was ready to walk as soon as we touched down. The sonar showed 100 meters to the seafloor. I activated the external camera system, even though I knew it wouldn't show me anything yet. The monitors flickered to life, displaying 6 different angles around the crawler. All of them showed the same thing: black water, empty and featureless. 50 meters. I positioned my hands on the control sticks, ready to take over manual piloting once the winch released. The Atlas wasn't designed for precision work. It was a brute, built for rough terrain and heavy loads. But it was reliable, and down here, reliable mattered more than elegant. 20 meters. The sonar image updated again, and I saw the debris field directly below me. The contacts looked sharper now, more defined. I still couldn't identify what they were. Metal, maybe, or dense rock. Hard to tell without visual confirmation. 10 meters. The Atlas's feet broke through the last layer of current, and I felt the crawler steady. The winch cable went slack for just a second, then tensed again as the system compensated. Almost down. 5 meters. I watched the depth gauge tick down, my fingers tight on the controls. The sonar showed the seafloor rushing up to meet us. Then contact. The Atlas landed hard, both feet hitting sediment at the same time. The impact rattled through the frame, shaking everything that wasn't bolted down. I felt it in my teeth. The crawler settled with a groan of stressed metal, and then went still. We were down. I waited for the winch cable to detach, listening to the clamps release with a series of metallic clanks. The cable retracted upward, disappearing into the darkness above. Now I was truly alone, sitting on the bottom of the Atlantic in a 40-ton machine, 3,000 meters of ocean pressing down from above. The panic tried to surge again. I shoved it back. I hit the floodlight controls. 6 high-intensity lamps blazed to life around the Atlas's hull, cutting through the water like searchlights. The cameras suddenly showed me the world outside, a landscape of gray sediment and black volcanic rock stretching away into the murk. Clouds of silt billowed up where the crawler's feet had landed, obscuring the immediate area. I gave it a minute to settle, then adjusted the camera angles to get a better view. The lights reached maybe 20 meters before the water swallowed them. Everything beyond that was just darkness. But what I could see was enough. The debris was real. Scattered across the seafloor in front of me were chunks of twisted metal, broken equipment, fragments of things I couldn't immediately identify. Some pieces were small enough that the current had half buried them in sediment. Others were larger, jutting up like monuments to something that had gone very wrong. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't a rockfall. This was wreckage. I checked the mission coordinates again, triple-checking that I was in the right place. The numbers matched. Trunk 7 should be about 50 meters northeast of my current position, right in the middle of whatever had happened here. I pulled up the communication system, keyed the transmitter. Surface, this is Atlas. I've touched down at the coordinates, confirming debris field on site, requesting guidance. Static answered me. Not unusual. The acoustic modem took time to relay messages through 3,000 meters of water. I'd get a response in a few minutes, maybe longer if the surface team was busy. I didn't want to wait. I activated the Atlas's hydraulic systems, feeling the crawler come alive around me. The control sticks responded smoothly as I tested them, moving the arms through their range of motion. Everything felt solid. Good. I engaged the leg servos and took a step forward. The Atlas moved like it always did, slow, deliberate. Each footfall a calculated placement of weight and balance. The cameras showed me the terrain ahead, and I picked a path through the debris, trying not to step on anything that looked fragile or important. The silt clouds followed me, kicked up by each step. I kept the speed low, maybe half a meter per second. No point rushing and breaking something. The sonar guided me toward Trunk 7's last known position. 40 meters, 35, 30. More debris appeared in the floodlights. I saw what looked like sections of pipe, bent and torn. A piece of framework that might have been part of a structure. Something round and smooth that I couldn't place at all. 20 meters. I adjusted course slightly, moving around a large chunk of wreckage that blocked the direct path. The Atlas stepped over a smaller piece, and I heard the foot scrape against metal as it came down on the other side. 15 meters. The cameras showed me something new, a long, dark line cutting across the seafloor ahead. I zoomed in with the forward camera. There it was. Trunk 7. The cable lay exposed on the sediment, its armored housing visible under the lights. It was thick, maybe 15 centimeters in diameter, designed to survive decades on the ocean floor. Except right now, it didn't look like it was surviving much of anything. I brought the Atlas closer, moving carefully until I was standing about 5 meters away. Then I stopped and really looked at what I was seeing. The cable had been severed, not frayed, not abraded, not crushed by rocks or torn by currents. Cut. The end of the cable showed clean separation, the fiber bundles inside exposed where the armored layers had been sliced through. I'd seen cable damage before. It usually looked messy, ragged, like something had grabbed it and pulled until it broke. This looked surgical. I moved the Atlas's right arm, extending it toward the cable. The manipulator hand opened, and I used it to lift the severed end off the seafloor. Sediment fell away as I brought it closer to the forward camera. The cut was smooth. Too smooth. My hands started trembling again on the controls. I brought the Atlas to a halt and stared through the viewport at what the floodlights revealed. The seafloor looked like a graveyard. Whale skeletons lay scattered across the silt, their ribs picked completely clean. I counted 3 of them in the immediate area, maybe more beyond the reach of the lights. The bones stretched out in different directions, some half buried in sediment, others propped up against volcanic rock formations. They weren't fresh kills. These had been here long enough for the scavengers to strip every last bit of flesh, leaving only the ivory-white skeletal frames behind. I adjusted the floodlight angle and caught sight of more debris. Crumpled metal jutted from the mud at strange angles, pieces of what looked like old shipwrecks. A section of hull plating sat wedged between 2 whale ribs. Further out, I spotted what might have been part of a mast or boom, bent nearly in half. The metal showed heavy corrosion, orange-brown rust, coating every surface where the floodlights hit it. My hands moved across the control panel, activating the lateral cameras to get a wider view. The debris field extended in every direction. A chaotic mix of bone and metal spread across at least 100 meters of seafloor. I tried to make sense of the layout, looking for any pattern or explanation for why so much wreckage had accumulated in this specific location. Then I swept the floodlights across Trunk 7, and everything else stopped mattering. The cable hadn't snapped from an earthquake or natural wear. Someone or something had tied the steel-armored line into massive, intricate knots. I sat there in the control seat, not moving, barely breathing, just staring at what the light showed me. The cable formed loops and twists that shouldn't have been possible. Trunk 7 was designed to handle incredible tension loads, built with multiple layers of steel armor over the fiber optic core. The damn thing could support its own weight across thousands of miles of ocean floor. Bending it took specialized equipment. Knotting it like this would require forces I couldn't even calculate. But there it was, right in front of me. Undeniable. The knots stretched across the fracture zone in a deliberate pattern, not random tangles or accidental loops from some kind of seismic event. These were purposeful, methodical. The cable had been wrenched into configurations that looked almost decorative, like someone had decided to turn a critical piece of communications infrastructure into some kind of twisted artwork. I leaned forward in my harness, trying to process what I was seeing. The closest knot sat about 10 meters from the Atlas's current position, a tight figure 8 that pulled the cable up off the seafloor by at least 2 meters. Beyond that, the line curved into what looked like a series of overhand knots, each one spaced roughly 5 meters apart. The pattern continued northeast, disappearing beyond the range of my floodlights. My brain kept trying to find rational explanations. Maybe the cable had gotten caught in fishing nets and dragged. But no fishing operation came anywhere near this depth. Maybe some kind of underwater landslide had twisted it, but the surrounding seafloor showed no signs of recent disturbance beyond the debris field, and that wreckage looked decades old at minimum. I checked the sonar again, sweeping the area for anything that might explain this. The readout showed the same irregular shapes I'd seen during descent, but now I could correlate them with what the cameras revealed. Whale bones registered as long, thin objects. Metal debris showed up as dense clusters. The cable itself appeared as a continuous line that looped and curved through the coordinates, like a tripwire. That word stuck in my head. Tripwire. The knots looked like they'd been placed with intention, set up to cross specific points on the seafloor. I followed the cable's path with the cameras, tracking how it wove between the whale skeletons and debris. In some places, the line ran underneath rib cages. In others, it wrapped around chunks of corroded metal. The whole thing formed a network that covered the fracture zone in a grid-like arrangement. I needed documentation. My company would never believe this without proof. The briefing had been clear about what to expect down here. Simple cable failure, maybe some damage from tectonic activity. Nothing that couldn't be explained by standard deep-sea conditions. What I was looking at now fell so far outside those parameters that I knew my verbal report wouldn't be enough. I activated the Atlas's external cameras, the ones mounted on the manipulator arm and along the hull's sides. The recording systems came online with a series of soft clicks that I felt through the frame more than heard. Red indicator lights appeared on my display panel, confirming that all 6 cameras were capturing footage. I started a slow pan across the site, moving the Atlas's torso rotation controls to give the cameras a full 360-degree view. The floodlights illuminated each section as I turned, revealing more of the same impossible scene. Bones, metal, cable knots. All of it spread across the gray sediment in an arrangement that made no sense. The recording timestamp showed in the corner of my helmet display, 15:43 local time, 3,000 meters below the surface. Charlie Gibbs fracture zone. Coordinates matching Trunk 7's last known position. I made mental notes of every detail, knowing I'd need to write a comprehensive report once I got back to the surface. If I got back to the surface. I pushed that thought away and focused on the immediate task. Document everything, get clear footage of the knots, show the scale of the debris field, prove that what I was seeing was real. I extended the Atlas's manipulator arm slowly toward one of the knots to get a closer look. The hydraulics responded smoothly, the arm unfolding from its resting position along the hull. I watched the articulated joints move through the water, each segment extending until the manipulator claw reached about 3 meters from the mech's center mass. The arm had 5 primary joints and a rotating wrist assembly that let me position the claw at pretty much any angle. I'd used it hundreds of times on previous jobs, grabbing cable sections, moving debris, operating tools. The controls were second nature at this point, my hands moving across the input panel without conscious thought. I brought the claw to within half a meter of the nearest knot, the one formed in that tight figure-8 configuration. The cameras mounted on the arm gave me a close-up view of the cable's surface. The steel armor showed scratches and scoring marks, deep gouges that ran along the twisted sections. Whatever had done this had applied enough force to deform the metal, leaving permanent impressions in the protective casing. I rotated the wrist assembly, angling the camera to capture different perspectives. The knot's complexity became more apparent at this range. The cable hadn't just been bent. It had been woven through itself in multiple passes, creating a structure that looked almost architectural. I counted at least 4 separate loops, each one threaded through the others in a way that would have required the cable to be completely flexible during the knotting process. That wasn't possible. Trunk 7 had maybe 30 centimeters of bend radius under ideal conditions. The loops I was looking at showed curves tighter than 5 centimeters in some places. As the arm reached out, I noticed the debris around the Atlas beginning to shift slightly in the water. Small pieces at first. A fragment of corroded metal near the mech's left foot rotated a few degrees, disturbing the sediment beneath it. I watched a section of whale rib that had been lying flat start to tilt upward, one end lifting maybe 2 centimeters off the sea floor. The movement was subtle enough that I almost missed it. But once I noticed, I couldn't look away. More debris began to shift. A piece of hull plating sliding sideways through the silt. Another bone fragment rolling in a slow arc. The displacements were small, incremental, but they were happening all around the Atlas in an expanding circle. I froze the manipulator arm's extension and pulled my hands back from the controls. The debris kept moving. The silt didn't just lift. It exploded upward in a massive eruption that swallowed everything. 1 second I could see the knotted cable, the whale bones, the debris scattered across the fracture zone floor. The next, my floodlights hit a wall of churning gray sediment so thick it looked like I'd driven into concrete. I yanked back on the lateral controls without thinking, pure reflex overriding training. The joystick jerked hard in my grip. My other hand flew to the torso rotation dial, twisting it counterclockwise to swing the Atlas's upper body away from whatever had just happened. The pressure hull groaned around me as the hydraulics strained to respond. Then the impact hit. Something slammed into the Atlas from below, a force so brutal it lifted all 40 tons of the crawler off the seafloor. My stomach dropped as the mech lurched upward and sideways. The viewport tilted at a sickening angle. I heard metal screaming against metal somewhere in the frame, felt the vibration travel through the control seat and into my spine. The cameras showed nothing but swirling sediment. Sonar pinged uselessly, the return signal scattering off a million suspended particles. I had no visual reference, no idea which way was up except for the gyroscope readout flickering on the main display. 23 degrees off level and climbing. My hand stayed locked on the controls, even though I had no clue what to do with them. The training simulations never covered this. Equipment failure, yes. Structural damage, yes. Getting hit by something 3,000 meters down in the middle of the Atlantic? That wasn't in the manual. The silt began to settle, just enough for the floodlights to penetrate a few meters. I saw motion through the murk. Not debris shifting in the current, but something massive and deliberate. Something rising. At first I thought it was another rock formation. Maybe a volcanic pillar I'd missed on the sonar sweep. The shape moved too slowly to be anything alive, a dark mass ascending through the sediment cloud with the weight of geology behind it. But then the surface of it changed texture as it came into the light, and I realized I was looking at skin. Mottled gray-brown skin covered in patterns that matched the surrounding seafloor perfectly, ridges and valleys that mimicked volcanic rock down to the barnacle clusters. The thing had been lying flat against the ocean floor the entire time. Right there, right underneath the debris field. Maybe underneath the Atlas itself when I'd landed. I'd been sitting on top of it and never knew. More of it emerged from the silt. The body kept rising, wider than the Atlas's floodlights could fully illuminate. I caught glimpses of the edge of it disappearing into darkness on both sides, a living continent pulling itself up from the mud. The skin rippled as it moved, sections of camouflage patterns shifting and realigning like watching a projection screen change images. Then I saw the tentacles. They unwrapped from the rock pillars I'd logged on sonar earlier, the ones I'd marked as natural formations and dismissed. Except they weren't pillars. They were limbs, each one as thick as the redwood trees I'd seen in photos from California, coiled around actual volcanic rock and holding so still that sonar had read them as part of the geology. The suckers on the underside were the size of manhole covers, and as the tentacles peeled away from the stone, I heard the scraping sound travel through the water and vibrate against the Atlas's hull. 1, 2, 3. 4 tentacles unwinding on my left side. I twisted the torso rotation, swinging the cameras right, and saw more. 6, 7, 8. The bases of them disappeared into the main body still rising from the seafloor, thicker than the Atlas's entire frame where they connected to the central mass. I'd seen pictures of giant squid before, specimens that washed up on beaches, dead things measured at 30, maybe 40 feet long. The scientists called them rare, deep-sea mysteries. This wasn't that. This was something else entirely. Something that made those specimens look like bait fish. The creature kept rising, and I finally saw the head, or what I assumed was the head, a bulbous mass the size of a cargo container, with skin that rippled through camouflage patterns too fast for my brain to track. 2 eyes, each one easily a meter across, reflected the floodlights back at me with a flat, alien intelligence. The pupils were horizontal slits, black against dark amber irises that seemed to glow from within. A kraken. The word hit me like cold water. Not the myth, not the legend sailors told in bars, the real thing, the actual animal that spawned every story about sea monsters dragging ships into the depths. It was here. It was real. And I was sitting in a metal can 3,000 meters down with nowhere to go. The tentacles kept moving, uncoiling from the rocks with deliberate precision. I tracked them on the cameras, watching the tips snake through the debris field, weaving between whale bones and rusted metal fragments. They moved with purpose, not random thrashing or hunting behavior. Coordinated, intelligent. One of the tentacles wrapped around something I couldn't see clearly through the sediment. The limb tensed, muscle rippling under the skin, and pulled. Hard. The cable net came up out of the mud like a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. Steel cables erupted from the seafloor in every direction around the Atlas, shedding sediment and debris as they snapped taut. I'd thought the knotted cable was just Trunk 7 damaged and tangled. I was wrong. It was a net, a woven grid of interlaced steel stretching across hundreds of meters of ocean floor, buried under just enough silt to hide it from visual inspection and sonar mapping. The kraken had laid a trap, and I'd crawled right into the center of it. The cables rose in a coordinated pattern, pulled up by tentacles positioned around the perimeter of the net. I saw it happening on 3 cameras at once, sections of the grid lifting in unison, edges rising faster than the center, forming a bowl shape with the Atlas sitting at the bottom. The steel caught the floodlights and reflected them back in harsh white lines cutting through the murk. I slammed my hand down on the leg servo controls, trying to get the Atlas moving, trying to drive forward or backward or anywhere that wasn't here. The hydraulics engaged with their usual hiss and whine. The front left leg extended, foot finding purchase on the seafloor. The net hit the crawler before I could take a single step. The impact came from above and all sides simultaneously, a massive weight dropping onto the Atlas with the force of a building collapse. Steel cables slammed into the torso housing, wrapped around the leg joints, tangled in the manipulator arm I'd left extended. The sound was deafening even through the pressure hull, metal on metal screeching and grinding as the net cinched tight. The Atlas tipped. I felt it going over, felt the gyroscope reading spike as the mech lost vertical orientation. 40 tons of industrial equipment, built to stay stable on uneven seafloor terrain, and it was falling like a toy kicked over by a child. I grabbed the manual stabilizer override, yanked it hard to the left, trying to compensate with the leg servos. Too late. The Atlas went over onto its right side with a crash that rattled every bolt in the frame. My harness caught me, straps biting into my shoulders and chest as my full weight swung against the restraints. The control seat was mounted to the hull interior, so when the mech tipped 90 degrees, I went with it, suddenly hanging sideways in the harness like a piece of cargo. Every alarm in the cockpit went off at once. Audio warnings screamed from 3 different speakers, overlapping into a wall of noise that made it impossible to think. Red lights flooded the interior, flashing from the damage control panel, the structural integrity monitor, the hydraulic pressure readouts. The main display flickered, went black for half a second, then came back online showing error codes scrolling faster than I could read them. I twisted in the harness, trying to get my hands back on the controls. The joystick was above me now instead of in front of me. The entire console rotated 90 degrees from where my muscle memory expected it to be. I reached up, or what used to be up, and grabbed the lateral control stick, fingers closing around the grip. The viewport showed nothing but seafloor now, the cameras pointing sideways or down into the mud where the Atlas had fallen. One floodlight was buried completely, the feed showing solid brown sediment pressed against the lens. Another pointed up at an angle, illuminating the net wrapped around the mech's torso and the tentacles still pulling it tighter. I could see the cables cinching in on the external camera feeds, steel braids thick as my arm crossing over each other and constricting like a living thing. The net had the Atlas completely covered, wrapped around the legs, the torso, the manipulator arm. Everywhere I looked on the monitors, I saw steel cables pulled taut, cutting into the mech's frame. The creature's tentacles kept working, pulling the net tighter with slow, inexorable strength. I watched one of them wrap around a section of cable near the Atlas's left leg, the suckers gripping the steel, and haul it another half-meter tighter. The leg joint groaned under the pressure, metal flexing in ways it wasn't designed to flex. I tried the leg servos again, hitting the activation switch for the right rear leg. The hydraulics fired. I heard them engage, but the leg didn't move. The net held it pinned against the seafloor. 40 tons of mech and all the servo strength in the world couldn't break through steel cables pulled tight by a creature the size of a building. The gyroscope reading held steady at 87 degrees off vertical. The Atlas was on its side, trapped in a steel web 3,000 meters below the surface, and I was locked inside with every warning light on the panels screaming that something had gone catastrophically wrong. I fought to orient myself, to make sense of the camera feeds and the instrument readings, and the fact that I was hanging sideways in a harness inside a metal coffin at the bottom of the Atlantic. My hands found the controls again, gripping the joysticks, even though I had no idea what I could do with them. The training was gone, burned away by adrenaline and the fundamental wrongness of everything happening outside the hull. The Atlas settled into the mud with a final grinding lurch, the weight of it sinking into the sediment. The net held fast, cables cutting into the frame. Through the working cameras, I could see the Kraken's tentacles still moving, still adjusting the tension, making sure the trap was secure. I was caught, completely trapped in the steel web, with a creature the size of a city block holding the other end. I yanked the controls hard left, trying to roll the Atlas upright against the cables. The hydraulic system screamed in protest, a high-pitched whine that cut through the cockpit and made my teeth ache. Nothing moved. The servos in the right rear leg fired, pushing with maximum force against the steel web, but the cables held firm. I could feel the resistance through the control sticks, that dead weight sensation when machinery hits something immovable. I tried the left front leg next, engaging the servo and pushing down hard. The mechanical joints groaned somewhere below me, metal grinding against metal. The leg extended maybe half a meter before the cables cinched tighter, wrapping around the knee joint and forcing everything to stop. A warning light flashed on the panel in front of me, hydraulic pressure redlining in the forward actuator. I pulled back on the controls, releasing the pressure before something ruptured. The groaning stopped. The Atlas settled deeper into the sediment with a grinding lurch that rattled my bones. Through the viewport, the water was still clouded with silt from the initial eruption, but the particles were settling now, drifting down in lazy spirals through the floodlight beams. The lights were still functioning at least. 6 external floods mounted on the hull, all pointing in different directions, creating overlapping cones of visibility in the murk. Then I saw movement. Not the slow drift of sediment. Something massive, shifting in the gloom beyond the lights. The Kraken. It had been underneath us the whole time, camouflaged against the volcanic rock and whale bones, waiting. Now it was rising. The creature's body emerged from the seafloor like a continent surfacing from the deep, shedding clouds of gray silt that billowed around its edges. The mottled skin rippled and changed, lightening from the dark gray-brown of the rocks to a paler shade as it moved away from the bottom. I watched through the viewport, unable to look away. The thing was enormous. The floodlights couldn't capture all of it at once. I saw sections, a curve of bulbous flesh here, the thick base of a tentacle there, but never the whole shape. It was too big. The head alone was the size of a shipping container, maybe larger. The body behind it stretched back into darkness, beyond the reach of the lights. 8 tentacles uncoiled from the debris field, each one thicker than the Atlas's torso. They moved with slow, deliberate coordination, peeling away from the volcanic stones they'd been gripping. Sucker pads the size of manhole covers released with audible pops that carried through the water and vibrated the hull. The tentacles rose, swaying slightly in the current, their tips pointing upward like the branches of massive trees. Then the eyes appeared. 2 of them, set on either side of the bulbous head, each one easily a meter across. The pupils were horizontal slits, black against glowing amber irises that reflected the floodlights with an eerie luminescence. They rotated independently, scanning the debris field, the net of cables, the trapped mech. One eye locked onto the viewport. Onto me. I felt my breath catch. The thing was looking directly at me, studying me through the reinforced glass. The pupil contracted slightly, adjusting to the light. I could see intelligence in that gaze. Not animal cunning. Something deeper. Something aware. I expected it to strike, to slam a tentacle into the cockpit, or bring that massive beak down on the pressure hull. I'd seen footage of giant squid attacking submersibles before. Quick, Violent impacts meant to crack the shell and flood the interior. That's what predators did. They went for the kill. But the Kraken didn't attack. Instead, it moved closer with slow, measured precision. The tentacles adjusted position, two of them extending toward the Atlas while the others maintained tension on the steel cables. The water between us cleared as the creature approached, silt drifting away, giving me a perfect view of what was coming. The nearest tentacle reached the mech's left side, just below my field of vision through the viewport. I felt the impact through the frame. A dull thud followed by the scrape of suckers gripping metal. The Atlas shifted slightly, tilting another few degrees as the Kraken took hold. Then came a sound I'd never heard before. A metallic screech mixed with tearing, like sheet metal being peeled away from a frame. It started low and built in volume, resonating through the hull and into the cockpit. I gripped the control sticks harder, knuckles white, even though I knew they were useless. Through the viewport, I saw the second tentacle move into position on the right side of the mech. Smaller hooks emerged from between the sucker pads, curved, chitinous structures maybe 30 centimeters long. They looked like fish hooks, barbed and sharp. The tentacle pressed against the hull, and those hooks dug into the seams of the armor plating. The creature pulled. The outer shell of the Atlas was designed to withstand crushing pressure at depth, but it wasn't built to resist being pried apart from the outside. The armor consisted of overlapping titanium plates, bolted to the frame, with reinforced seals at every joint. The Kraken's hooks found those seams and exploited them. I watched in horror as a section of plating on the upper right quadrant began to separate from the frame. The hooks wedged deeper, levering the plate upward. The bolts holding it in place started to pop, one after another, each one releasing with a sharp crack that echoed through the cockpit. The plate bent, warping under the force, and then tore free completely. The tentacle tossed the plate aside. It tumbled through the water, spinning end over end, before disappearing into the darkness beyond the floodlights. The Kraken didn't pause. The same tentacle moved to the next section of armor, hooks finding the seams again, pulling with that same methodical precision. Another plate bent and tore away. Then another. My external camera feeds were mounted on those plates. The screens in front of me started going dark. The forward camera died first, its feed cutting to static as the Kraken ripped the plate off. Then the left lateral camera. Then the rear camera. One by one, the monitors went black, leaving me with nothing but the viewport for visibility. I tried the radio again, keying the transmit button and speaking into the headset. Surface control, this is Atlas. Emergency situation. Repeat, emergency situation. Requesting immediate extraction. Static answered me. The acoustic signal would take minutes to reach the surface, and minutes more for any response to come back. I didn't have minutes. The Kraken continued its work. The creature moved around the Atlas with disturbing care, each tentacle performing a specific task. 2 tentacles held the mech steady, suckers gripping the lower frame. 2 others peeled away armor plating, exposing the inner structure. The remaining 4 maintained tension on the cable net, keeping the whole trap secure. I realized what I was watching. This wasn't a random attack. The Kraken wasn't trying to crush the mech or smash it apart. It was dismantling it, piece by piece, layer by layer. It was hunting. The creature had trapped the Atlas in the cable net like prey in a snare, and now it was opening the shell to get at what was inside. The soft meat. Me. Another plate tore free, this one from the lower left side. I felt the Atlas shift as the structural integrity weakened. More warning lights appeared on the control panel. Hull breach alerts, pressure differential readings, system failures, cascading through the mech's network. Through the viewport, I could see exposed framework now where the armor had been. Hydraulic lines, servo motors, the skeletal structure of the mech's left leg, all of it visible. vulnerable. The Kraken's tentacle moved closer, hooks scraping against the bare metal, searching for the next seam to exploit. The right lateral camera went dead, then the upper camera. I was down to just the viewport now, that single reinforced window showing me exactly what was coming. The Kraken's eye appeared again, filling my field of vision. The amber iris glowed in the floodlight, the horizontal pupil a dark slash across its center. The eye moved closer until it was less than a meter from the glass, studying the viewport, studying the pressure hull beneath the stripped armor. I stared back, unable to move, unable to think of anything except the fact that I was 3,000 meters down in a damaged mech being systematically taken apart by a creature that shouldn't exist. The eye rotated, focusing on something below the viewport. A tentacle rose into view, hooks extended, reaching for the cockpit's armor plating. The harness bit into my shoulders as the Kraken's tentacles wrapped around the reinforced glass dome above me. I couldn't move back any farther. The pressure hull groaned, a long, low metallic screech that vibrated through the cockpit frame and into my chest. Two of the creature's primary arms coiled around the sphere, sucker pads the size of dinner plates pressing flat against the viewport. The glass flexed inward maybe half a centimeter, then another half centimeter. I gripped the control sticks harder, knuckles white, even though there was nothing left to control. The Atlas's legs were pinned. The manipulator arm was crushed against the frame. Every system that could move was either jammed by steel cables or stripped down to hydraulic lines and servo housing. The groaning got louder, deeper, the kind of sound that meant structural failure was coming soon. Then I saw it, a hairline fracture splitting the glass directly in front of my face. It started at the upper left quadrant where one of the tentacles pressed hardest, a thin white line no thicker than a strand of hair. It spread slowly, branching downward in a jagged path toward the center of the dome. I watched it grow, centimeter by centimeter, tracing a route across my field of vision like lightning frozen in place. My breathing got shallow, fast. I forced myself to slow it down, counting in my head. 4 seconds in. Hold. 4 seconds out. The fracture kept spreading. Another crack appeared on the right side. This one moved faster, zigzagging across the glass in sharp angles. The two lines hadn't met yet, but they would. Maybe in 30 seconds, maybe less. I reached for the trenching plow controls, fingers fumbling over the switches on the left console. The plow was a last-ditch tool, designed to dig the Atlas out if it got stuck in soft sediment. It was mounted on the underside of the frame, a hydraulic blade that could extend and retract with enough force to shove several tons of mud out of the way. If I could get it deployed, maybe it would hit one of the tentacles holding the cable net. Maybe it would hurt the Kraken enough to make it let go. I flipped the activation switch. A yellow indicator light blinked on, then immediately turned red. The hydraulic pressure gauge didn't move. I toggled the extend command anyway, jamming the lever forward as hard as it would go. Nothing. The plow was completely jammed. The steel cables wrapped around the Atlas's lower frame had crushed the hydraulic lines or bent the blade housing past the point where the servos could move it. I pulled the lever back and tried again. Still nothing. The red light stayed red. I let go of the controls and pressed both palms against my thighs, trying to think. The cracks in the viewport were longer now. They'd almost reached the center. When they met, the whole dome would shatter. Water pressure at 3,000 meters would crush the cockpit in less than a second. I wouldn't even feel it. Something scraped against the glass, a grinding, rhythmic sound like stone on metal. I looked up. The Kraken's beak was pressed against the viewport, just above the spreading cracks. It was massive, easily a meter wide, curved and sharp like a parrot's but scaled up to nightmare proportions. The upper and lower mandibles were dark gray, almost black, with ridged edges that looked designed for shearing through bone or titanium. The beak opened slightly, then scraped downward across the glass, carving a thin groove into the surface. I flinched back against the harness, even though there was nowhere to go. The beak lifted and repositioned, scraping again in a different spot. Testing. The creature was testing the viewport's integrity, checking for weak points the same way I'd check a weld before trusting it with load-bearing weight. This wasn't random aggression. It was methodical, deliberate. I watched the beak move across the glass in a grid pattern, scraping here, pressing there, returning to spots where the cracks had spread furthest. The kraken's eye appeared beside the beak, one of those huge amber eyes with the horizontal slit pupil. It didn't blink, just stared at me through the damaged viewport while the beak kept working. The creature was solving a problem. The problem was me, trapped inside a metal shell it wanted to open. I'd seen octopuses in aquarium footage, the way they could unscrew jar lids or navigate mazes. But those were small, human-sized intelligence in an animal that weighed maybe 20 pounds. This thing was bigger than a commercial fishing trawler, and it was using the same kind of reasoning. It had laid a trap with steel cables. It had stripped the Atlas's armor plating by exploiting the seams. Now it was figuring out how to crack open the cockpit. My hands were shaking again. I shoved them under my thighs and sat on them, staring at the control panels like they might suddenly offer a solution. They didn't. Every screen showed red warnings or blank readouts. The radio was still spitting static. The external cameras were gone except for the one on the manipulator arm, and that feed showed nothing but mud and a tangle of steel cables. The depth gauge read 3,004 meters. The internal pressure was holding at 1 atmosphere. The hull temperature was 4 degrees Celsius. All useless information. I needed something I could use. My eyes tracked across the cockpit, scanning every surface. The emergency toolkit mounted on the right wall, just basic hand tools, nothing that would help against a creature this size. The backup oxygen system, good for 12 hours but irrelevant if the viewport shattered. The flare gun in the storage compartment under my seat, designed for surface signaling, completely useless down here. Then I looked through the viewport again, past the beak and the cracks and the massive eye watching me. The severed end of Trunk 7 was lying in the mud about 3 meters away, right where I'd seen it when I first arrived at the site. The steel armored cable was cut clean, fiber bundles exposed, lying half buried in sediment. Dead. Useless for communication. But the Atlas wasn't running on the cable. It was running on the tether. I sat up straighter, ignoring the harness digging into my shoulders. The power tether was still connected. It had to be. The mech systems were still operational, the lights were still on, the control panels were still receiving power. That meant 10,000 volts were running down a reinforced cable from the surface ship through 3,000 meters of ocean straight into the Atlas's main power coupling on the dorsal frame. 10,000 volts. Enough to run hydraulics, servos, floodlights, and every other system on a 40-ton mech. Enough to kill. I pulled my hands out from under my legs and reached for the engineering diagnostics screen on the center console. My fingers were still shaking, but I managed to navigate the menu. The tether status page loaded slowly, displaying voltage, amperage, and connection integrity. Everything read green. The coupling was intact. Power flow was steady. The Kraken's beak scraped across the viewport again, and another crack split the glass near the bottom edge. I didn't have much time. The tether itself was insulated. Triple-layered rubber and polymer shielding designed to prevent any electrical discharge into the surrounding water. As long as the insulation held, the current stayed contained inside the cable. safe, controlled. But if the insulation was breached, if the interconductors were exposed to seawater, the electricity would arc outward looking for ground. At this depth, with this much voltage, the discharge would be massive, violent, potentially lethal to anything in the immediate vicinity. I pulled up the tether schematic on the screen, tracing the cable's path from the dorsal coupling down the Atlas's spine to the external anchor point on the lower frame. The anchor point was designed with a manual release mechanism, a fail-safe in case the tether got snagged and needed to be jettisoned. I'd never used it, never even tested it during training. But the controls were right here on the panel, a red guarded switch labeled Tether Release. If I released the tether, it would disconnect from the Atlas and fall free. The surface ship would lose power telemetry, but the mech had an internal battery good for maybe 6 hours. Long enough. But that wasn't the plan, forming in my head. I looked at the viewport again. The beak was still grinding against the glass. The cracks had spread into a spiderweb pattern covering almost a third of the dome. The Kraken's tentacles were still wrapped tight around the pressure hull, squeezing slowly, testing for failure points. If I could get the tether into contact with one of those tentacles, and if I could breach the insulation at the same time, the current would discharge directly into the creature. I had no idea if it would be enough to hurt something that size. Maybe it would just irritate it. Maybe it would do nothing at all. But it was the only option I had left. I navigated to the manipulator arm controls and checked the camera feed. The arm was pinned against the right side of the frame, partially buried under steel cables, but the joints were still functional according to the diagnostics. The claw was closed, gripping nothing. I could move it maybe a meter, maybe less, before the cables stopped it. The tether anchor point was half a meter below the arm's current position. Close enough. I engaged the shoulder servo and pushed the control stick forward slowly. The arm groaned, hydraulics whining as they fought against the cables holding it down. It moved maybe 10 centimeters before jamming. I pulled back, adjusted the angle, and tried again. Another 10 centimeters. The Kraken's beak slammed into the viewport hard enough to make the whole cockpit ring like a bell. I kept working the arm, inching it downward in tiny increments. 15 centimeters. 20. The camera feed showed the anchor point coming into view at the edge of the frame, a reinforced collar where the tether connected to the mech's power bus. 30 centimeters. The claw was almost level with the anchor now. I rotated the wrist joint and opened the claw, extending the fingers as wide as they'd go. Then I brought the arm across, moving lateral instead of down, until the claw was positioned around the tether cable just above the anchor point. I closed the claw. The fingers gripped the insulated cable firmly, the pressure sensors reading green. Now came the hard part. The claw had a cutting edge on the inner surface of each finger, hardened steel designed to shear through rope, net, or cable if the manipulator got tangled. I'd used it once during training to cut a test cable about half the thickness of the tether. It had taken maybe 3 seconds of full hydraulic pressure. This cable was thicker, reinforced, but the claw was strong. I engaged the cutting function and maxed out the hydraulic pressure. The arm shuddered, and the pressure gauge spiked into the red. The camera feed showed the claw tightening, the cutting edges biting into the tether's outer insulation layer. The Kraken's eyes swung back toward the viewport, pupil contracting as it focused on me again. The claw cut deeper. The insulation split, peeling back in ragged strips. Beneath it, I could see the secondary polymer layer, bright yellow, already deforming under the pressure. The beak hit the viewport again. The cracks spread farther, reaching the edges now. The secondary layer gave way. The claw cut into the inner conductors, braided copper cables carrying 10,000 volts from the surface. The electrical arc was immediate. I stared at the Kraken's flesh pressed flat against the cockpit glass. The texture looked rough, mottled gray-brown with darker patches near the sucker pads. Water ran in rivulets down the viewport where the tentacles shifted, and I could see the individual muscle fibers flexing beneath the skin. Wet. Completely soaked in seawater. Conductive. My eyes dropped to the right manipulator arm's control panel, specifically to the power transfer port indicator, a small green light I'd barely noticed during training. The system was designed for jump-starting other equipment in the field, transferring power from the Atlas's main feed to disabled machinery. 10,000 volts running down from the surface ship, enough to run the mech's hydraulics and servos, enough to restart a dead crawler or repair platform, enough to electrocute something wrapped around the hull. The idea hit me like a physical blow. Stupid. Desperate. Probably suicidal. The Kraken's tentacles covered most of the Atlas's frame, gripping tight with those massive sucker pads. If I rerouted the entire power feed into the manipulator arm and activated the transfer port, the current would arc directly into the creature's flesh. 10,000 volts through seawater, through wet conductive tissue, straight into the thing trying to crack me open. But the Atlas was also sitting in that same seawater. The frame was titanium, insulated where it mattered, but I'd seen the armor plating torn away, exposed hydraulic lines, stripped structural supports. If the current arced wrong, if it found a path through the damaged hull back to the cockpit, I'd fry along with the Kraken. I looked at the cracks spreading across the viewport. They'd grown into a spiderweb pattern covering almost half the glass now, branching out from the two main fracture lines. The Kraken's beak scraped rhythmically just above my head, testing the weak points. 30 seconds, maybe less, before the whole thing gave way. Screw it. I made the decision and reached for the main power controls. My hands moved fast across the console, flipping switches in sequence. First, I killed the external floodlights. All 6 went dark simultaneously, and the murky water outside turned black. Then I shut down the internal cockpit lighting, the control panel backlights, the instrument displays. The gyroscope indicator went dark, the depth gauge, the pressure monitors, everything. I hit the main power cutoff last, and the Atlas died completely. The cockpit went silent. No hum from the servos, no background whir from the hydraulic pumps, no electronic beeps from the warning systems. Just absolute quiet and total darkness. I hung in the harness, suspended sideways in the pitch-black cockpit, listening to my own breathing echo inside the pressure hull. My lungs pulled in air and pushed it out in ragged bursts. I could hear my heartbeat thundering in my ears, a rapid drumbeat that seemed way too loud in the silence. Outside, through the viewport, I could barely make out shapes. My eyes started adjusting, pulling in whatever ambient light existed 3,000 meters down, which was basically nothing. But I could see the Kraken's outline, a massive shadow darker than the surrounding water. The creature had paused. It stopped dismantling the mech. The tentacles went still, sucker pads holding position but no longer pulling at the frame. The beak lifted slightly away from the glass. I watched the shadow shift, the huge head tilting as if listening. It had been sensing the vibrations. The Atlas's systems had been running constantly since I touched down on the seafloor. Hydraulics pumping, servos adjusting, gyroscopes spinning, cooling fans running, all of it creating noise and vibration through the frame, through the water. The Kraken had felt every bit of it, tracking the mech's activity through the signals transmitted into the surrounding ocean. Now the mech was dead silent. No vibrations. No noise. From the creature's perspective, the Atlas had just stopped functioning. I held my breath and watched the shadow move. The Kraken's tentacles spread wider, repositioning around the hull. Two of them slid along the frame, sucker pads gripping and releasing in sequence, testing for movement or response. The head moved closer to the viewport, and I saw the faint amber glow of one massive eye reflecting some impossible light source I couldn't identify. The pupil contracted into a thin horizontal slit as it focused on the cockpit. The beak descended again, moving directly over the viewport. The creature adjusted its grip, pulling the tentacles tighter and spreading them in a wider stance around the mech's frame. Better leverage. More pressure distributed across the hull. It was preparing for the final crush, the one that would crack through the reinforced glass and flood the cockpit with freezing seawater and 3,000 meters of pressure. I had maybe 10 seconds. My hands moved across the manual override panel in the darkness. I couldn't see the controls, couldn't read the labels, but I'd trained on this system for 2 weeks before the company certified me for deep-sea operations. Muscle memory took over. My fingers found the first switch, a recessed toggle on the left side of the panel. I flipped it up, hearing a faint click. That disabled the primary safety lockout. Next switch, center panel, larger than the others. I pulled it down, and the mechanical resistance told me I'd bypassed the automatic shutdown protocol. The third control was a rotary dial, and I turned it clockwise until it stopped. That rerouted the power feed, disconnecting it from the main distribution system and isolating it to a single output channel. My right hand dropped to the lower panel and found the manual override lever, a heavy mechanical switch that required both hands to operate under normal circumstances. I gripped it tight and pulled straight back. The lever resisted, held in place by a spring-loaded lock, but I kept pulling until I felt it click past the detent and lock into the open position. The entire surface power feed was now isolated and rerouted, bypassing every safety protocol the Atlas had. 10,000 volts running down the tether from the ship above, no longer distributed through the mech's systems, just sitting in the main line waiting for an output path. I reached for the manipulator arm controls and found the power transfer activation button. It was covered by a protective cap, a small hinged piece of plastic designed to prevent accidental engagement. I flipped the cap open with my thumb and rested my index finger on the button underneath. The Kraken's beak touched the glass directly above my head. I felt the contact through the frame, a dull scraping vibration transmitted through the titanium structure into the cockpit. The cracks in the viewport spread further, branching out in jagged lines that reached toward the edges of the dome. The pressure differential was building. The glass was failing. I pressed the button. The Atlas shuddered. Hard. The whole frame vibrated like a tuning fork struck at full force. I felt the feedback through the controls. The joystick buzzed in my grip, the lever trembled against my palm, and every metal surface in the cockpit hummed with residual current. The Kraken's body went rigid in seizure. I couldn't see it through the white glare, but I felt the change in resistance through the arm. The creature's muscles locked solid, every tentacle going stiff at once. Then the glow shifted. The white light took on a blue tinge, spreading outward from where the claw connected to the gill slit. The Kraken's entire body began to glow bright blue from the inside, like bioluminescence, but wrong. Artificial. Electric. The current was arcing through the creature's internal fluids, lighting it up like a neon sign. I could see the silhouette of its organs through the translucent mantle tissue, backlit by the electrical discharge coursing through every nerve and muscle fiber. The water around us boiled. Instantly. The temperature spiked so fast that the seawater flashed to steam in a massive explosion that blasted outward in all directions. The shockwave hit the Atlas like a freight train. The entire mech jerked backward, the cable net straining, and my harness dug into my chest and shoulders as the force tried to rip me forward. The Kraken's body rocketed away from the cockpit, tentacles trailing behind it, still glowing that eerie blue as it tumbled into the darkness beyond the white steam cloud. My head snapped forward. I tried to brace, but the angle was wrong. The cockpit tilted at 87 degrees, and my skull cracked against something solid. The edge of the control panel, maybe, or the harness mount. Pain exploded behind my eyes, sharp and immediate, and then everything went black. Awareness returned slowly, like surfacing from deep water. I didn't know where I was at first. Didn't know how much time had passed. My head throbbed with a pain that pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat, centered just above my right temple. I tried to open my eyes, but the light hurt. Actual light. Not the floodlights, not the electrical arc. Something else. I forced my eyes open anyway. The cockpit was still tilted at a steep angle, maybe 60 degrees now instead of 87. The gyroscope was offline, so I couldn't confirm. The harness held me in place, straps cutting into my shoulders and waist. My neck ached from the awkward position. But through the cracked viewport, through the spiderweb of fractures that somehow hadn't shattered completely, I could see actual sunlight filtering down through blue water. Blue water. Not black. Not the absolute darkness of the deep trench. Blue. I blinked, trying to focus through the pain in my head. The light was diffuse, scattered, coming from above and spreading through the water in soft rays. I could see particles drifting past the viewport, bits of organic matter and sediment suspended in the current. The water had color again. Depth. Visibility extended maybe 20 meters instead of the 3-meter range of the floodlights. The Atlas was moving upward. I felt it now, the steady pull from above, the vibration of the winch cable reeling in. The mech swayed slightly as it ascended, rotating in a slow spiral. I looked at the control panel. Most of the systems were still dead, red warnings everywhere, but the winch connection indicator showed green. The surface ship had reeled me in. They'd hooked the cable back to the Atlas and started the extraction. I was being winched toward the surface. My hands were still on the controls, fingers locked around the joystick and lever. I released them slowly, flexing my fingers to work out the cramps. My right hand trembled. I looked down at it, watched the tremor, and couldn't make it stop. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving behind exhaustion and the dull ache in my head that wouldn't quit. The viewport showed more light with each passing second. We were rising fast, maybe 2 meters per second, based on the rate the blue was brightening. I tried to estimate depth, but had no instruments to confirm. Maybe 1,500 meters, maybe less. The pressure differential would be significant. I checked the hull integrity readout, still mostly red, but the pressure seal around the cockpit showed yellow instead of critical. The viewport had held. Somehow, despite the cracks, despite the Kraken's beak and the electrical explosion, the reinforced glass had held. I let my head rest back against the seat. The movement sent another spike of pain through my skull, and I winced, reaching up to touch the spot where I'd hit the panel. My fingers came away wet. Blood, probably, though I couldn't see it clearly in the dim light. I pressed my palm against the wound and applied pressure, trying to slow the bleeding. The Atlas continued its steady ascent, the winch cable pulling me up through the water column, away from the fracture zone, away from the debris field and the whale bones and the knotted steel cables, away from the Kraken. I didn't know if the creature was dead. Didn't know if 10,000 volts through the gill slit was enough to kill something that size. The blue glow had been bright, the seizure immediate, but I'd lost consciousness before seeing the outcome. For all I knew, it was down there right now, recovering, waiting. But I was rising. The cable held, the hull held, and the light kept getting brighter. I reached for the camera controls with my left hand, fingers moving slower than they should have. The panel was dark except for the red emergency power indicator, but I found the external feed switch by touch and flipped it. 3 of the 6 screens came to life, showing static first, then grainy footage from the cameras that hadn't been torn off during the Kraken's dismantling. The first screen showed the hull plating, what remained of it. Deep gouges ran through the titanium where the creature's hooked tentacles had pried the armor away. The second screen displayed the cable net, still tangled around the mech's legs but slack now, no longer under tension. The third screen made me stop breathing. Tentacles. Massive gray-brown tentacles wrapped completely around the Atlas's frame, coiled tight around the torso section and wound through the leg joints. The sucker pads, each one the size of a manhole cover, were pressed flat against the metal. I counted 4 arms visible on that camera alone, which meant there had to be more on the other side, out of view. The skin was mottled with darker patches, the texture rough and barnacled, and the whole mass was completely still. No movement, no flexing, no subtle shifts in position. The tentacles hung limp in the water, draped over the mech's frame like dead weight. I watched the feed for 30 seconds, then a full minute, looking for any sign of muscle tension or deliberate grip. Nothing. The arms swayed slightly with the motion of ascent, moved only by the current and the winch cable's pull, but showed no independent action. The Kraken hadn't released its hold. Even in death, the creature's arms remained locked around the Atlas, wrapped so tightly that the mech and the carcass were ascending together as a single tangled mass. I pulled my hand back from the controls and pressed it against the side of my head again. The bleeding had slowed but hadn't stopped. My fingers came away red and I wiped them on my coveralls, leaving a dark streak across the fabric. The headache intensified when I moved too quickly, a sharp pain radiating from the point of impact above my right temple. I looked back at the camera feed showing the tentacles. The arms were enormous, far larger than I'd fully registered during the confrontation. Each one had to be at least 9 or 10 meters long, maybe more, thicker than my torso at the base where they connected to the main body. The suckers varied in size, the largest ones concentrated near the center of each arm, the smaller ones tapering toward the tips. Between the suckers I could see the curved chitinous hooks that had torn through the Atlas's armor plating, retracted now but still visible as dark points emerging from the flesh. The mech shuddered slightly, a vibration running through the frame. I grabbed the control sticks on instinct, but there was nothing to adjust. The winch was doing all the work. The Atlas was just cargo now, hauled up like salvage with a massive corpse wrapped around it. I tried the radio again, more out of habit than expectation. The static was different now, less dense, with occasional breaks that might have been voices. We were close enough to the surface that the acoustic delay was shortening, but still too deep for clear communication. I released the transmit button and waited, listening to the hiss and crackle. I checked the external feed one more time. The tentacles were still there, still wrapped tight, still completely motionless. The Kraken's body was out of frame, somewhere below or behind the mech, but the arms told me everything I needed to know. The creature was dead. The electrical discharge had stopped its heart or fried its nervous system or done enough damage to both that it couldn't survive. I'd killed it with 10,000 volts routed through a manipulator arm designed for cable repair and light construction work. Then we broke through. The transition was sudden and violent. Water poured off the mech's hull in sheets. The viewport cleared, and I was staring at open air and gray sky. The Atlas swung slightly on the cable, then steadied. I heard voices immediately, shouting, calling out directions and warnings. Boots hammered on metal decking. Equipment clanged and scraped. I sat in the harness, hands still on the controls, and listened to the crew mobilize around the mech. Someone was yelling about the hatch, Someone else was calling for cutting equipment. A third voice, farther away, kept repeating the same phrase over and over, but I couldn't make out the words. The support crew worked fast. I heard them climbing on the Atlas's frame, heard the clang of boots on the torso plating, and the scrape of tools against metal. The hatch was on the left side of the cockpit, sealed from the inside by a manual lock I'd engaged during descent. I reached for it now, twisted the handle counterclockwise, and pushed. The hatch resisted, stuck or blocked, then gave way with a sudden pop of released pressure. Cold air rushed into the cockpit. I sucked in a breath and tasted salt and diesel fuel and something organic I couldn't identify. Hands reached through the hatch opening, grabbed my shoulders, and pulled. I unclipped the harness with my right hand, the left still pressed against my head, and let them haul me out. My boots hit the deck, and I nearly fell. Someone caught me, steadied me, wrapped something around my shoulders. A thermal blanket. The fabric was rough and metallic, crinkling when I moved. I stood there, gripping the blanket closed with one hand, and turned to look at the Atlas. The mech hung from the winch cable about 2 meters above the deck, water still streaming from every surface. The armor plating was gone from large sections of the hull, exposing the internal framework and hydraulic lines. The legs were bent at wrong angles, tangled in steel cables that hung loose and dripping. And wrapped around the entire frame, coiled tight and unmoving, were the Kraken's tentacles. The crew had stopped shouting. They stood in a loose circle around the mech, staring up at the massive gray-brown arms draped over the Atlas, like some kind of obscene sculpture. No one spoke. No one moved. I counted the tentacles from where I stood. 4 on the left side, visible from this angle. Probably 4 more on the right. 8 total, each one over 9 meters long, thick as a telephone pole at the base and tapering to points that still looked strong enough to crush bone. The suckers were clearly visible now, hundreds of them per arm, the largest ones showing serrated edges and the dark curved hooks I'd seen on the camera feed. One of the crew, a younger guy I recognized from the pre-dive briefing but whose name I couldn't remember, walked slowly toward the mech. He stopped about 1 meter away and reached out, hesitated, then touched one of the tentacles with his fingertips. He jerked his hand back immediately. "It's cold," he said. His voice was quiet but carried across the deck in the silence. Another crew member, older with graying hair and a weathered face, moved to the winch controls and started lowering the Atlas onto the deck. The mech descended slowly, the tentacles swaying with the movement but showing no independent motion. When the Atlas touched down, the frame settled with a heavy metallic thud, and the tentacles draped across the deck plating, spreading out from the mech's torso like the petals of some grotesque flower. The crew moved in with cutting equipment, plasma torches, hydraulic shears, industrial saws. They worked carefully, almost reverently, slicing through the tentacles one at a time to free the mech from the corpse. Each severed arm was dragged to the side of the deck and laid out in a row. The process took almost 20 minutes. I stood the whole time, wrapped in the thermal blanket, and watched them work. My head throbbed, and the bleeding had started again, a slow trickle I could feel running down the side of my neck. Someone tried to get me to sit down, to let them check the wound, but I waved them off. I needed to see this, needed to watch them cut the creature apart. When the last tentacle was severed and pulled away from the Atlas, the crew stepped back and looked at what they'd done. 8 massive arms laid out in parallel rows on the deck, each one longer than a telephone pole, each one studded with hundreds of sucker pads and retractable hooks. The mech stood in the center, battered and stripped of armor, freed from the Kraken's final grip. The older crew member walked over to me. He had a first aid kit in his hand and a grim expression on his face. "You need to let me look at that head wound," he said. I nodded but didn't move. He set the kit down, opened it, and pulled out gauze and antiseptic. He worked quickly, cleaning the wound and applying pressure to stop the bleeding. I barely felt it. My attention was locked on the tentacles. "What the hell happened down there?" he asked quietly, pressing a bandage against my temple. I didn't answer. Didn't know how to answer. Another crew member approached from the stern, moving quickly across the deck. He was pulling something behind him, dragging it with both hands. It took me a moment to register what I was seeing. The Kraken's body. The main mass of it, the mantle and head, being hauled across the deck on a cargo net. It was even larger than I'd thought. The mantle alone the size of a compact car, the head bulging and asymmetrical with the massive eyes half closed and clouded. The beak protruded from the center of the tentacle crown, a curved black structure the size of both my fists together. They dragged it to the center of the deck, near the severed tentacles, and let the net settle. The body rolled slightly, one eye turning toward the sky. The pupil a horizontal slit that reflected nothing. The crew gathered around it. Someone took photographs. Someone else measured one of the tentacles, calling out numbers I didn't process. A third crew member crouched next to the head, examining the beak and the surrounding tissue with gloved hands. I stood apart from them, still wrapped in the blanket, and stared at the carcass. The creature was dead. Completely, unquestionably dead. The electrical discharge had killed it instantly, or close enough that it made no difference. The tentacles had locked in a final death grip around the Atlas, the muscles frozen in rigor. And we'd been hauled to the surface together. The older crew member finished bandaging my head and stepped back. He looked at me, then at the Kraken, then back at me. "You brought that thing up from the trench?" he asked. "It was already wrapped around the mech," I said. My voice sounded distant, like someone else was speaking. "It didn't let go." He nodded slowly, processing that. "You know what this is?" "Yeah." "You know what it means?" I looked at him, then back at the carcass. The Kraken's body lay sprawled across the deck, surrounded by its severed tentacles, its eyes clouded and empty. I thought about the cable net hidden beneath the sediment, the deliberate knots tied in Trunk 7, the systematic way it had dismantled the Atlas's armor plating, the intelligence I'd seen in its eye before I'd killed it. "Yeah," I said. "I know." More crew members approached, asking questions I couldn't focus on. What had I seen? How deep was the encounter? Was the mech repairable? How had I survived? Their voices overlapped, urgent and confused, but I couldn't find words to answer them. I stood there, staring at the massive carcass they were hauling into position on the deck, and felt the weight of what I'd done settle over me like a second blanket. I'd gone down to repair a cable. A simple job. Locate the failure point, assess the damage, make repairs if possible, or mark the site for a follow-up team. Standard deep-sea maintenance work I'd done a dozen times before. Instead, I'd found something that used tools, something that built traps, intricate and deliberate, woven from stolen infrastructure and laid across hundreds of meters of seafloor, something that hunted with real intelligence, with patience and strategy, and an understanding of its environment that went far beyond animal instinct. And I'd killed it with the very power line I'd been sent to fix.